Cold exposure gave me better skin, digestion, sleep, and it made me more peaceful. After watching this video, I promise you, you'll know why. You may know Wim Hof, you may know that he's broken a bunch of records, sure. But there's one record in particular that I want you to understand. He broke the world record for the fastest half marathon beyond the Arctic Circle. So I want you to imagine something. You're gonna run in minus 10 to minus 20 degrees Celsius beyond the Arctic Circle in Finland. It's snowy. You're gonna run barefoot and in shorts. And it's a pretty long run, okay? And you're gonna attempt to break the world record. You have to be very healthy to do that, right? You have to go through a lot of training. Now what you have to realize is at the time, the only thing Wim Hof did for his health is actually nothing. He didn't do anything. After breaking the world record in this insane temperature, in these insane conditions, he goes back to a cabin, sits at the fireplace, puts a towel around him, and he starts smoking and drinking alcohol. Yes, Wim Hof used to drink, or I don't know if he still does, but at this time, when he broke the world record, he was smoking and drinking. And he wasn't eating anything in particular that was healthy. He wasn't doing any other kind of practice except maybe breathing and meditation. But that's all. That's all he did. So he broke the record despite doing all these things that are unhealthy. So how come someone had the cardiovascular fitness, a body that's capable of doing something that most humans on the planet can't do? It must be because of the cold exposure. Name an adult on the planet who smokes and drinks who can do the same thing. You can't. You can't, can you? The only thing that distinguishes Wim from anyone else is the amount of cold exposure he had done. And after watching this video, you will know why he was able to break the world record despite being an alcoholic who smokes a lot. When I was in El Salvador, I met a woman with multiple sclerosis. She couldn't use her legs very well. She had to walk around with 2 canes and it was very slow, and this was in the place we were staying at. Outside of the house, of course, she needed to be pushed in a wheelchair, and if you know anything about multiple sclerosis, you know that people with multiple sclerosis usually struggle with bowel movements, so they get constipated. Now, during the time I was in El Salvador, she tried cold exposure. I talked to her about it. I said that, yeah, your genes are pretty good for cold exposure, you should try it. Even Jack Cruz said that you should probably do it, from what I recall. So she does cold exposure, and guess what happens? Afterward, she feels great. Her legs, she can move them a lot better after doing the cold exposure, and she has a bowel movement. I've lived in Sweden all my life. The winters are very harsh here. Last winter was my absolute best winter yet. I crushed this winter. People usually get bad sleep and they get notoriously very depressed during the winter here. I did not. I enjoyed the winter to the fullest, and I never wore a jacket. I did an insane amount of cold exposure this winter, and I had never ever felt better during a winter in my life. This is me doing 7 minutes in 0.8 degrees Celsius water. That's 35 degrees Fahrenheit approximately, very close to freezing. And I took 5 cold showers every day, something like that. I craved the cold, I needed it. I went outside, shirtless, in minus 11 degrees Celsius to see the sunrise. I became elite in terms of cold exposure to make this video, so that I can evaluate cold exposure before I tell you anything. I've read a bunch, and this is the culmination of my understanding of cold exposure. Let's begin. A few things happen when you do cold exposure. One is your dopamine goes up. Dopamine is what gives you the desire to live. So if you're depressed, you will have low dopamine levels. If you have high dopamine levels, you'll be very happy. You'll desire to live. But also it makes you desire other things as well. That's why it's associated with addiction, etc. Norepinephrine also goes up. You might have taken a cold shower and felt way more focused, like your mind is working way better. That's mostly due to norepinephrine. Something that goes down is an inflammatory cytokine that's called interleukin-6. Now, it goes down long term, it can go up short term. Another thing that goes up is adiponectin. Diabetics have low adiponectin levels. People who are metabolically healthy usually have higher adiponectin levels. So, if you're increasing adiponectin, which is cardioprotective, it protects your heart, that's a very good thing. Adiponectin is very important because it signals for the creation of brown fat. Now, what is that? You have different kinds of fat in your body. You have visceral fat, which sits around the organs. You have subcutaneous fat as well. Subcutaneous fat sits below the skin. It's the fat that you see, below the skin. On your stomach, if you have a big stomach, that's a bunch of subcutaneous fat. Might also be visceral fat if you have it, let's say, around your organs and it's really pushing out your gut. That might also be the case, but that usually happens if you're older, unhealthy, an alcoholic, etc. So, subcutaneous fat, that's white fat, is just storage. It's also an endocrine organ, it creates leptin, it creates hormone, but it's mostly for storage. Now, beige fat is sort of an intermediate between white fat and brown fat, and it contains more mitochondria. Now, what are the mitochondria? They're the engines of the cell. When you're in the cold, you need to warm yourself up, right? This heat comes from your metabolism. Your metabolism increases. But where does metabolism occur? In your cells, yes, but where in the cell? The mitochondria, your engines, of course. They're the ones that are creating the heat. So, what happens to the fat is that the body puts a bunch of mitochondria in there. It increases the amount of mitochondria in the subcutaneous fat, and it turns it a darker color because of the amount of mitochondria. So you create beige fat, but also eventually, if you become cold adapted, brown fat. Everyone has brown fat from what I understand, but you'll create more brown fat in general. And brown fat is called brown fat because it's very dense in mitochondria, and it usually sits at your neck, your traps, upper back, and below your clavicles. That's usually where you'll find the most amount of brown fat. Another thing that happens is that you create alpha MSH. This will be very relevant throughout the video. Alpha MSH is the thing that makes you tan. It is the thing that's created when you get UVA, and that is what makes your skin tan. That is also created when you do cold exposure. Another thing that rises acutely is leptin. Leptin is a reflection of the energy status in your body. It is the hormone that is the measurement of that. It is the master controller of your metabolism. So, assuming your receptors are working correctly, and there's a lot to say about the receptors because they're equally as important as leptin itself. If your leptin is very high, that means you've probably eaten. Your hunger hormone is also going to be low, ghrelin. Ghrelin is going to be low, leptin is going to be high. That means you're not hungry, you're satiated, you're full, you don't want to eat. If your leptin levels are low, your ghrelin levels are probably going to be high, and that means you want to eat. But this is assuming we're talking about standard human physiology. In the cold, this changes. In your hypothalamus, you have something called neuropeptide Y, or NPY. NPY makes you more hungry. It stimulates appetite and it makes you crave more carbohydrates. Now, in modern society, we see that people crave carbohydrates even during the winter. Why is that? Well, you're gonna know that in a moment. NPY rises or is associated with longer light cycles. So that means that the day is longer than the night. This happens at higher latitudes where you have 4 seasons, where there's a period of the year where it gets cold and where it gets warm. So longer light cycles, which means it's warmer. And of course, warmth, so it's not cold. Do you know what shuts off NPY? Cold. Cold exposure shuts off NPY. Now, is this convenient during the winter? Can you even find carbohydrates? Honey, apples, blueberries, can you find any of that during the winter? Of course not. So you're designed to not eat carbohydrates during the winter. Nature forces us to do that if we choose to live at higher latitudes. And our carbohydrate cravings are shut off, they're completely gone, because we're in the cold. We're designed to do that. This is an evolutionary system that's built into us, that's built into every mammal. Now let me blow your mind. In the cold, CD36 rises, and one of the things that happens is that CD36 alters your taste buds. They make you crave more fat. And fat will also taste better. So you're also designed to want to eat more fat from cold exposure. Cold exposure literally changes your taste buds. So it seems as though we have very specific adaptations to cold. This means that it should be impossible to have carbohydrate cravings when it's actually cold in your environment. But people eat carbohydrates and they crave carbohydrates in cold places in the world when it is cold. And this is because they're not exposed to the cold. That's because their houses are warm. They wear excessively warm clothes and they're not cold adapted. And so they never get CD36 and they never get the elimination of NPY. What I'm about to tell you I find absolutely fascinating. There's, of course, the circadian rhythm. which is a 24-hour cycle that repeats itself. And what controls it is light and dark and temperature, so mainly the sun. You being exposed to your environment ensures that your circadian rhythm is good, as long as you don't blend in a bunch of artificial light and you're exposed to the actual temperature in the environment. Now, there's something called the circannual cycle. You know how the circadian rhythm drastically changes your biochemistry throughout the day and the night, because that's absolutely needed? What your cell is doing at 8 a.m. is drastically different than 8 p.m., for example, 12 hours later. It's the same thing with the yearly cycle. There's a yearly cycle, that's why it's called circannual cycle, where your biochemistry changes drastically throughout the seasons. Summer is completely different to winter. Now, is this happening in modern society? No, it is not. And what I'm trying to tell you is that cold exposure activates and informs this system. Not only that, the light cycles. You know how it gets cold in Sweden, and Sweden is very high up in terms of the latitudes. It's the 59th latitude. So during the winter, it's pretty dark and the day is short. The fact that the day is short also informs this system of what's going on. Longer light cycle, again, more NPY. Shorter light cycle, but especially cold, shuts off NPY. So your carbohydrate cravings go away. You see how the environment controls nutrition? See how the environment controls you? Which means that cold exposure isn't some kind of new age fad. The ice baths, the whatnot. No. It's a very, very deep, evolutionary, seasonal genetic program that's buried into you, that needs to be activated every winter. Not activating it is like having artificial light above you when it's dark outside. It's a mismatch between what's happening inside your body, what your body's detecting, and what's actually happening in your environment. And when that happens, we get disease. And that's why when you look at the science of cold exposure, you have the short-term effects of, if you take an untrained person, of cortisol rising, of this rising, of that rising, and then reacting to it a certain way. But when you take people and you actually cold adapt them, different things happen. You know how, for example, if you calorie restrict or you eat less carbohydrates, you do zero carb, your T3 levels can suffer? Well, that doesn't happen in the cold because your thyroid is actually controlled by the brain. It's not controlled by TSH anymore. The thyroid hormones, the T3 and the T4, get controlled by the brain, by TRH instead of TSH. Another thing that happens is you need to eat far less. Not only do you become more energy efficient for reasons we're gonna talk about in a moment in the video, but you also drastically become more leptin sensitive and you get really, really low leptin levels. So not only do your carbohydrate cravings go away, you're also less hungry overall. You can sustain yourself on less calories. Again, seasonal genetic program. You're gonna have less food available during the winter, and so of course it makes sense that the cold would also shut off your appetite to a large extent. Have you ever wondered why we are so incredibly adaptable as a species? Well, we evolved at the equator, right? So we should be able to handle the equator. Yes, if you're light-skinned, you should probably be in the shade a bit, sit below a tree when it's noon. Probably not a very good idea to sit in UV 14. But again, you can build up to tolerating way more UV than you think. And you've also got people in the Arctic regions, right? So how come one species is within the Arctic Circle and also at the equator? How does that work? Well, according to Dr. Jack Kruse, or something he says often, is that we evolved at the East African Rift. And that seems very plausible. I think if you're gonna point out any place, that's probably the best place to point at when it comes to human evolution. But he says that mammals evolved at the polar regions. So what does that mean? That means that since we're a mammal, we have cold programs built into us, even though we evolved at the equator. Do you understand where the adaptability comes from now? And that is why humans can adapt to the cold. That is the reason why. Because we are mammals, and mammals are experts at surviving the cold. Again, we have survived a bunch of ice ages, so we have to have systems for handling the cold, hunting in the cold, being in the cold without too much difficulty. And we see this with healthy people. And we're gonna get into the fact that if you're healthy, you'll be able to handle the cold, provided you have the right genetics. There are certain people who will not be able to do this, and we need to discuss those people. But then here's the question. We have a bunch of systems, and many of them change our biochemistry drastically. We have one for starvation even. But starvation, especially over prolonged periods of time, is probably not the best idea, right? So who says that activating this system during the winter is healthy? Why would you want to do this? Well, first of all, creating enough heat during the winter seems very useful. You'll be able to be outside for longer periods of time comfortably. That sounds like a very good idea, doesn't it? Second, you shut off carbohydrate cravings and you need to eat less. You also utilize fat better, and your diet during the winter should be, if you live at a higher latitude, should be fat and protein. There are no carbohydrates in your environment. And so your body shouldn't be thinking that there are carbohydrates in the environment because of the systems that are built into it. Again, remember, NPY. You need to shut off NPY. When your body knows what's happening in the environment, your food will actually be processed differently. That's why if you're creating heat, if you're cold adapted, the fat that you eat and the protein that you eat, they will be processed differently. The amounts you eat, they will be different. Everything will be different. Yes, I'm saying that you need to expose yourself to the temperature and the environment. Nothing else would be adequate. You are built for that. Now you might say, well, if you're an Inuit and you're wearing this big fat coat, or maybe it's -40, are you then saying that they should be naked and then wearing these very warm clothes is a bad idea? No, they need that for survival, and the reason is because they live beyond the Arctic Circle. That is an extreme environment. Who said that humans need to live there? Now, what's amazing is that they can be healthy despite being in an environment where humans shouldn't be, which is honestly amazing. It speaks to our adaptability, but they will need clothes. They cannot walk around naked. But let's say you're in Spain, Portugal, some latitude that is, let's say, below 40. Yeah, then you can be naked outside all year. That is what you need to do, because then you're exposed to the temperature in the environment and the light in the environment. Both are very important, the light and dark cycles and the temperature. Now, up until now, it might seem vague. Okay, we need to avoid environmental mismatches, I understand that. We need to be exposed to the environment. The Inuit are wearing warm clothes because they're in an extreme environment where humans technically shouldn't be, and we need to take measures to actually live there. But what's the real reason as to why we would need cold exposure during the winter? Well, let me tell you this. When you avoid environmental mismatches, just remember that you're doing far, far more than you realize. There's far more to the story than you might realize. Trust me, that is always the case with light. Oh, notice how I didn't say temperature, because this cold exposure thing is really about light. The reason why we can't go to high latitudes is because we require sunlight. Sunlight is the greatest healer out there. Just read The Healing Sun. The first effective treatment for tuberculosis was sunlight. Babies who have jaundice, the cure for them, it seems, is to expose them to sunlight. In my experience with clients, the absolute best thing for leaky gut, for skin issues, for digestive issues, is sunlight. And again, I got this idea from my first interview with Dr. Jack Cruz. I actually applied the knowledge and it works. That's why I made the acne and skin health video, which is actually also a digestive healing video, because it's practically the same thing. It's one big system, one interconnected system, literally interconnected. It's as Jack Cruz says, light, water, magnetism. When you dig into life on this planet, that's really where it begins. But so the question is, we have water and we have magnetism at higher latitudes. We even have higher magnetism at higher latitudes, and the water is even deuterium depleted, so those things actually improve at higher latitudes. Usually, you know, you go to Sweden, you're gonna find beautiful nature. Estonia, Norway, Finland, absolutely beautiful nature. Central Europe, it's all green. We have all that. But what we don't have as much is light. And when it gets cold, we get very short days, and we get a lot of cold. No sunlight. And we absolutely need sunlight. It's one of the most important healers out there. It's one of the most important things for human health. Now, what are the wavelengths that are the most healing? Well, it's infrared light and it's UV. Those are the two most important ones. And if you watch the sunlight video, you'll know why that is. Also, if you watch the water video that I made and the detoxification video, you'll also know why that is. But again, we're following up. Each video is an upgrade. So, during the winter, you still have infrared coming through the clouds because, again, usually the sky is pretty cloudy. You don't have a lot of sunlight, at least here in Sweden, here in Stockholm. So you're still getting infrared because infrared passes through the clouds and through your clothes. But you don't get any UV. And the strength of the infrared is really bad, of course. I mean, yes, okay, you get a little bit of infrared. It has a drastic effect on you because a little infrared is better than no infrared. But if you go to Costa Rica, El Salvador, the Canary Islands, and you lay there and you sunbathe, well, of course, you're getting way more infrared and way more of an effect on your cells from the infrared than if you just walk shirtless during sunrise during the 13th of December, somewhere up north, of course. Again, so you get a little bit of infrared, but not too much, and you get no UV, practically no UV whatsoever. What does this have to do with cold exposure? Well, it's very related, and it's the reason why cold exposure is so incredibly important, and it's the reason that convinced me to actually start reading more about it and experiment with it. Cold exposure, again, makes you create heat. You go into an ice bath for a while. Of course, your body starts creating more heat. What is heat? Infrared light. Where does that come from? The mitochondria. So your mitochondria are creating more light, and that is hitting the water in your cell. Again, you've got the cell, you got the mitochondria in the cell, and what's around them? Water. So they create more heat, and that gets stored in the water, and it improves the net negative charge in the cell, which is your battery. And so if that happens to the brain, you get smarter. If that happens to the digestive tract, you can digest food better. If that happens to the skin, you get better skin. You see what I mean? You increase the amount of energy. You're not actually losing energy, you're gaining energy. Because that frequency of light is absolutely needed for your cells to function optimally. That's one. Two, are you actually creating UV? You are creating UV. That is 100% scientifically proven. How do I know this? There's a gene called POMC. It's the only gene that's translated by UV light. Now we know that when you do cold exposure, you create alpha MSH. Alpha MSH is the same thing that makes you tan. You see, you have to have a gene to have the ability to tan as a human. If you didn't have the POMC gene that reacted to UV light, you would never be able to get melanin production in the skin. You would not get darker. That is an ability that humans have, right? So alpha MSH is the thing that makes you tan. We know that it goes up. You produce it when you do cold exposure. And the only way to produce alpha MSH, based on what I understand, is from UVA. So that means that if you're doing cold exposure and alpha MSH is rising, again, when you're doing a sufficient amount of cold exposure, that must mean that you're creating UV light inside. And actually, we don't even need to approach it through this angle. This is the proof. This is the actual proof that this is happening. But when we look at cells, is this actually happening if we observe cells? Yes, it is happening. And if you want, you can read the book Light in Shaping Life by Roland Van Wyck. There he talks about biology and biophotons, how life is emitting light. And the mitochondria, they emit UV light. Every cell, all life on Earth, emits UV light. But when you do cold exposure, of course, you emit more, and you emit it in different frequencies of UV. What does the sun give you? Beta endorphins from the UV. It also gives you dopamine from the UV. It also gives you a bunch of other things. We don't need to list them here. But does the cold do the same thing? Well, yes, it does. It does do that. It drastically increases your dopamine, doesn't it? What does that as well? Sunlight, as I told you. Many of the things that you get from the sun, you get them from cold exposure. Is that a coincidence based on what we know now? What you know now? No, absolutely not. Same thing with alpha MSH. Do you produce alpha MSH in UV? Yes, you do. Do you produce alpha MSH in the cold? Yes, you do. The same gene is being translated by the same light. This means that you can get UV when it's cold, but only if you expose yourself to it. You can't sit in your warm house all the time throughout winter. That would be unhealthy. And now you understand why cold is so important and also how I view cold. If you have a coin, one side of the coin is sunlight, and for people at a higher latitude who have the ability to create heat very well because of their mitochondrial DNA, the other side is cold exposure because it gives you the light frequencies that are missing during that part of the year. That is why I did it so much during this winter and why I had never felt better during a Swedish winter and why I absolutely crushed this winter. And now you might understand why it's so important to become cold adapted. This is the reason why you do it. It's because when you become cold adapted, you can handle cold better, you can create more light as well. And so if you're able to create more light, you become healthier. Why? Because it's the equivalent of getting more sunlight, or at least, if you want to say it in a more accurate manner, you're able to get more infrared and UV from inside. What you're essentially doing is, because you're gonna need to turn more fat into heat, what you're doing is this. You're eating fat, right? And you're turning that mass into light in the form of infrared heat, and then UV, and you're storing that energy inside of the cells. Let's say you have a piece of metal and you put it in the sun. Again, the infrared hits it and then it's re-emitted. No, the reason why you are a living organism that lives for very long is because you're able to get energy from the environment and actually store it in your cells. So you're not gonna lose all the heat, you're gonna store it in your cells as energy. And as I told you before, oh, you had brain fog before? Do a little bit of cold exposure. Dunk your head in. And I've had people tell me in the comments, oh, I did cold exposure and my brain fog went away. I can think extremely clearly. If the sun heals it, then cold exposure can do the same thing, provided that you can create the light inside. Some people are too sick to do that, and so of course they need external support. You always need external support at some point. But this is how we adapted to higher latitudes. This, again, the IR light, the UV light, that we create inside, that is exactly how we adapted to higher latitudes. Without this ability, we would not be able to live at higher latitudes in a healthy manner. And this is why the Inuit can be healthy. That's why that is possible. It's just very, very hard. You have to be, like if you have a phone, forget about being healthy there. You have to live without technology. And you have to really, really follow nature up there. But when you're at the equator, you have more leeway because of the sun. If you've seen my full day of living in the cold north, you might recall that I was at that time reading this book called The Vital Question by Nick Lane. Now, this book is absolutely amazing because it talks about how energy is central to life. And what creates energy in your cells? Of course, you should know that by now. It's the mitochondria. They also create the light. This book explained to me why you can't sit on your bum all day. You have to actually move. It's very important that you move. And the reason is because when you start using your mitochondria more, the electron transport chain goes faster. To understand why this is, you have to understand how the mitochondria works. So you've got the inner mitochondrial membrane and you've got the outer mitochondrial membrane. And then you have the intermembrane space, which is between the outer membrane and the inner membrane. So again, imagine an oval inside an oval. The inner oval is the inner mitochondrial membrane. The outer oval is the outer membrane. Between the two ovals, you have the intermembrane space, and then inside you have the matrix. In the inner mitochondrial membrane, so the oval that's inside, it actually doesn't look like an oval. It's got a bunch of squiggly lines to increase surface area so that you can create more energy. But in there, that's where metabolism happens. Or you've got the complexes at least. So the complexes are where the electron transport chain happens. And this is the thing that creates a proton gradient. So in the matrix, you don't have many protons, so hydrogen atoms floating around. But in the intermembrane space, you have a bunch of protons. And the reason is because you have pumps in the inner mitochondrial membrane called complexes. So you have got complex 1, complex 2, complex 3, complex 4, right? 4 complexes. The 5th one is a spinning hydrogen gun. But essentially, these 4 complexes pump hydrogen into the intermembrane space to create a gradient. So imagine, if you have a lot of water on this side of a wall and very little water over here, and you make a little teeny tiny hole, the water is going to flow pretty strongly through that hole, right? So you're creating, potential energy. That's what you're doing inside of every single mitochondria in your body currently, unless the mitochondria is, on the verge of dying or is currently dying, which, of course, you're constantly recycling mitochondria, so maybe that has happened. This analogy of there being a little hole in a dam is pretty accurate, because the fifth complex is not something that pumps protons into the intermembrane space to increase the gradient. It's actually going the opposite direction. So the hydrogen, of course, you got a lot of hydrogen here, then little hydrogen in the matrix. The hydrogen wants to go through the membrane, and it does so through the ATP synthase, which is a spinning nanomotor. It's a nanomotor. And the hydrogen goes through and spins really fast, and it creates ATP. That's how ATP is created. What's powering the pumps, the complexes, is electrons, the flow of electrons. And where do these electrons go? They go to oxygen. That's why you breathe. Now you know why you breathe. Oxygen goes and accepts the electrons that are going through the complexes. By the way, I should add, complex 2 doesn't pump protons. It's only complex 1, 3, and 4 that does this, not 2. And when the electrons are accepted by oxygen, you create 2 molecules of water. So you remember how in the water video I told you that your mitochondria create water? This is how it's happening. All the oxygen that you're breathing, provided it's actually being utilized, is becoming water. And also free radicals, but those are needed, and you'll know why that is soon. Why is this important? Well, because if electrons get stuck in the complexes, what happens is that it becomes highly reduced. So if you have many electrons in there, and they're not necessarily being used because, let's say, you're not exerting yourself, or there's some kind of issue, and the electrons can't jump from one complex to the other, or from one redox center to the other, what happens is that oxygen is more likely to react or take up these electrons and create free radicals. So it's doing it at the wrong place in the chain. It's supposed to do it after complex 4 or at complex 4, but now it's doing it at the other complexes because all the electrons are over there. They're getting stuck there. So when this happens, the mitochondria is supposed to basically signal for the cell to kill itself, so that these dysfunctional mitochondria just cease to exist, so that they're gone, and then all this material gets recycled. At any given moment, you have an amount of mitochondria that are working really good, and you have bad mitochondria. And maybe you'd want to replace these, right? You'd want these cells that have these dysfunctional mitochondria to probably not continue dividing, to kill themselves, and then you'd want your best mitochondria to continue spreading throughout the body, right? That's in an ideal situation. Now, you might have bad mitochondria, but maybe they're not creating enough free radicals, because again, the creation of free radicals is what signals for the cell, or for the mitochondria to signal for the cell to kill itself. We don't need to necessarily go into the details, but the details are in here. Highly recommended book, by the way. Let's say you do cold exposure. What happens? Well, now your mitochondria need to do a little bit more work, right? So those that aren't working correctly, they will accumulate free radicals and signal for the cell to kill itself. And so what happens is that anywhere where you have mitochondria that are dysfunctional, the cell will kill itself and disallow the mitochondria, the bad mitochondria, from replicating, from spreading, while all your good mitochondria will continue. This is called mitophagy, and you need to have a certain amount of strain to make sure that your mitochondria recycle themselves and stay healthy. It's you could say a J or a U-shaped curve, where if you do nothing, you'll be unhealthy. If you do just the right amount, you'll be the healthiest because you're actually making mitophagy happen. But if you do too much, you're gonna mess yourself up. You're actually gonna damage your mitochondria. And yes, now you understand why movement also is important. I'm not telling you to run a marathon. That's not what you need to do. Actually, that's probably counterproductive because it messes you up in certain ways. But for mitophagy, to clear out your bad mitochondria, to maintain good cardiovascular health in general, walking a lot, hiking, maybe running a little bit, playing football, playing tennis, playing whatever sport or Doing whatever movement form you'd like is a very good idea instead of just sitting around all day doing nothing. You need to make mitophagy happen. You need to clear out your bad mitochondria. And a perfect way to do this and also support your mitochondria, because again, sunlight is the greatest supporter of mitochondria out there, which means that cold also is, to get that support during the winter where the sun is taking a vacation somewhere else, probably in the southern hemisphere if you're in the northern hemisphere, and vice versa, you need to do cold exposure. Did you know that humans can photosynthesize? Did you know that melanin turns all frequencies of light into electricity, so energy that powers the cell? Now that might sound very, very far-fetched, I understand. But it's actually the work of this guy, Arturo Solis Herrera. And he wrote a book called The Human Photosynthesis, where he proves that this is the case. So for example, when you're getting UV, when you're in the sun and you're getting UV, what's happening is you split the water molecule. So now you have hydrogen, you have oxygen, and you have electrons. Now what does the cell need? It needs hydrogen, it needs oxygen, and it needs electrons. That is what powers metabolism, isn't it? Those are the basic components. There are other things you need, but these are the basics, right? And so that splitting of the water powers the mitochondria, it powers the cell. Now, I told you that your cells emit light as well. And we have melanin inside. If you don't believe me, look up the substantia nigra. That's a region in the brain that is heavily melanated. Why is there melanin in the brain? Maybe it's because of what we've said earlier and what we've just said now. Okay, so melanin turns light into energy for the cells, right? And all your cells are emitting light. So if you have melanin inside, what would that do? Well, if I have understood all of this correctly, you're emitting light and you're recycling all the light. So melanin is allowing you to use the light, that's a byproduct of metabolism, to power more metabolism without just losing the light. You're actually recycling the light that you're creating. Now you're putting this together, aren't you? Or maybe we can do it together. Cells emit light, okay? Cold makes you emit more light. Melanin helps you utilize the light. So that means that if you don't have enough melanin, you might not benefit from cold exposure. Let me give you a real-life example. In El Salvador, the people who follow Jack Cruz and Atami would arrange for ice baths so that everyone could do ice baths together. And we'd have a wonderful time together. It's really nice to do it in tropical regions, trust me, because afterward you can get into the tropical sun and it's just absolutely amazing. Call it unnatural if you want, you have to try it out. And then you have to go to sleep that night and tell me if you slept better or worse. Actually, a young man who I'm happy to call my friend, who I met in El Salvador, he was dealing with some issues. I am for the most part healthy. I'm happy to call myself healthy. I did ice baths over there. I'd sleep like a baby. I'd sleep extra well. I'd feel amazing throughout the day. I'd just feel really, really nice. He would feel nice, and this is what he told me in conversation. He would feel nice sort of after the ice bath, laying in the sun, etc. But then at night he would have sleep issues. So here we see how one person who maybe has enough melanin inside has no problems benefiting from cold exposure, doing cold exposure and actually benefiting from it, while another person who doesn't have enough melanin, for example, on the inside, will not benefit from it because they cannot utilize what they've just created. You see how that works? Remember alpha MSH? It's the thing that makes you tan in the sun when you get UVA. Now, cold exposure also increases alpha MSH. We've already established that you create UV light inside when you do cold exposure, and that's the only way for alpha MSH to be increasing in the cold. This has to be the case. That is a proof of this being the case because that gene is translated by UV light, right? So if it's increasing, that means cold exposure is making you emit more UV. That's established, sure. Now, you need melanin. I've already told you that you need melanin for your brain to work, for your organs to work. You have it in many places in the body, from what I understand. If you're listening to someone with high cognitive capacity and they're really getting the words out, would that mean that their brain has a lot of mitochondria, or really functioning mitochondria, I should say, energy efficient mitochondria? Is that tissue energy efficient, or is it poor? Is it bad? No, of course, it's energy efficient, right? If someone has brain fog, are the mitochondria in their brain working well? No. Now, let's take that concept and put it on the digestive tract or the liver or the pancreas. Is the same the case? Absolutely. Bad pancreas, bad mitochondria in the pancreas. Bad liver, bad mitochondria in the liver. Digestive issues? Oh, you can't digest anything? You have bad mitochondria in your digestive tract. Now, did I tell you that melanin is very important for, well, any tissue really, for optimal energy efficiency? Yes, because of its mechanism. We've already established what the mechanism of melanin is. It probably does a bunch of other things, but this is the most basic way to explain it. If you lose your tan on the face first, and the rest of your body looks more tan, what does that mean? Let's say you've been sunbathing, let's say in France, you live in France. You've been sunbathing in the summer. Now autumn and winter come around, and of course there's no UV, you can't sunbathe, it's probably cloudier anyway, and you're slowly getting more pale. What does that mean? Well, you're probably sucking in the melanin, aren't you? The melanin isn't just going out there. Your tan isn't disappearing to the outside, it's disappearing to the inside. We know that we have melanin inside, and we have melanin requirements, so that is something we've established so far. Now, if you're losing it, let's say on your digestive tract, or your face first, what would that mean? That would mean that there's a melanin deficiency in the brain, for example. I've even asked Jack Cruz this. I asked him this. This was my second question to him in my second interview with him. There's an interesting observation that I've made when it comes to melanin, and I think if I ask this question, it might make the person listening understand this even more, because most people think about tans as just the color of your skin, but it's far more than that. So what I've noticed is that some people retain their tan better than others. Some people get a tan and then they lose it very quickly. And more specifically, I've noticed that some people lose the melanin on their face more quickly than their body. And so I guess that that's because of internal melanin deficiency. And I guess that when you lose it a lot in the face, that indicates that the brain has a lack of melanin, more specifically. But I'm not sure about that. That's why I'm asking you.
You're absolutely correct. And actually, you just described the mechanism of vitiligo. You just described the life of Michael Jackson.
And he confirmed that this is the case. If you're losing it on your face first, you have a melanin deficiency in the brain, and you're losing it here first because it's being sucked in faster. That is the case. So, you need melanin, right? And I told you that you can get it from UVA, right? You can build it on the outside and then suck it into the inside. You continue being in the sun, you continue building it up, you'll suck in some of it, you'll continue building it up, and then eventually, you're at a good level and your tan, you maintain it quite easily, depending on what your starting point is, depending on what you choose to do about it, whether you go to Costa Rica or you go from Sweden to France, for example. That might fix it a little bit because you get a little bit more sun, but it's not enough. Didn't I tell you that cold exposure creates melanin? So now you know that the way you don't get a melanin deficiency is by continuing to do cold exposure during the winter. Again, not only do we get UV and IR through cold exposure during the winter when, again, the sun is taking a vacation to the southern hemisphere or the northern hemisphere, we also get melanin. You get melanin, you're able to build melanin. So without cold exposure, you have no way of getting melanin. And if you think, again, that this is some hooey-wooey stuff, check out this study. Mitochondria tan cells. It's confirmed. It's in the scientific literature. Things are rarely black and white. Although this might be about the health benefits of cold exposure, there are people who shouldn't do cold exposure. At least they might not really benefit from it. These people are the people who are adapted to equatorial environments where you really do not need to create any heat. So coupled mitochondria, that's what they have. Coupled mitochondrial haplotype. There are also uncoupled people. These people are less efficient at creating energy because they also create heat. Before we get into the absolute details, just let me say something about this because it might seem like uncoupled mitochondria are worse. It completely depends on the environment. Why? Think about Carnot's theorem. So it states in basic terms that if you have an engine, you increase the energy efficiency of the engine if you get a large difference between the engine's internal temperature and its environment. So, if you have an engine that's running at, let's say, I don't know, 100 degrees Celsius, something like that, and it's minus 50 outside, that would be way more efficient than an engine running at 50 degrees Celsius and it being 0 degrees Celsius outside of the engine. The larger the difference, the more energy efficient the engine gets. Now, what is the mitochondria? An engine, right? So, if you're creating heat and it's very cold in the environment, based on physics, based on Carnot's theorem, you will be very efficient, right? It's quite obvious that uncoupled people are the Finnish people, the Swedish people, the Icelandic people, the Central Europeans, the people in Central Asia as well. Any place where it gets colder, you'll have more uncoupled mitochondria so that you can create heat. I am uncoupled. I am not necessarily coupled. I am less uncoupled than someone who is from Sweden, that's blonde and has blue eyes, but I'm still pretty uncoupled. Why? Because if I run for 30 seconds, I get really hot. If I start working out in minus 10 degrees Celsius, I'm completely fine if I'm shirtless. Remember Arturo Solis book, The Human Photosynthesis? Look at the Equatorial Africans. They have a lot of UV in their environment, and they also have a lot of melanin on their skin. So they're directly getting energy from the sun, from the strong UV, by having so much melanin on their surface. They're better able to utilize UV. They can utilize the really high UV, while, for example, I can't be in UV 14, UV 13. Usain Bolt would be able to. The marathon runners, the Kenyans, the Ethiopians who always win year after year, gold medals in the Olympic marathon, or every 4 years I should say. They all have coupled mitochondria. It's a great advantage to have coupled mitochondria if you're a marathon runner, because instead of creating heat, you're only, powering your muscles without creating heat. And usually there's enough heat in the environment where they run the Olympic marathon. If they run the marathon in minus 10 degrees Celsius, I think the type of winner would change though. If you look at the Maasai, if you look at the Dinka tribe, if you look at the Fulani, the Samburu, the Nilotic tribes in Africa in general, you usually see that they're thinner. In Equatorial Africa, you usually see that they're a bit thinner, especially if they're tall. This is advantageous. If you have a lot of body mass, you can't really dissipate heat. And remember, it's really hot over there. So they're able to handle heat really well. They don't need to create heat either. They're able to utilize UV from their environment because of their skin. They're absolutely amazing skin for that environment. Therefore, they also need to eat less. And to contrast the Equatorial Africans, instead of looking at the Swedes and Finnish people and Norwegians and Icelandic people and Central Europeans, anyone who needs to create heat, let's look at the people who really need to create heat. The Inuit, for example. Think about the primitive Inuit or the isolated Inuit. They're eating lots of fat. They're turning this fat into heat. And then the heat is, of course, light. So they're turning the fat, the mass, into light, and they're storing it again. So they're getting light from the fat that they're eating. Going back to the Africans, when I was in El Salvador and Costa Rica, you think I had to eat as much fat? No, my fat requirements dropped a bunch. Why? Instead of using the fat to create light here in Sweden, I was able to get it from the sun. I didn't need to eat as much. And so if you're coupled, if you have darker skin, and you live at a higher latitude, this is really bad news for you. And the reason is because me, for example, if you look at my pictures from before, I used to, utilize the sun a lot, at least during the summer, I get very pale. I easily get very pale. And so I can sort of do okay here. I can utilize cool exposure and create the light that I don't get here. This also means that, again, if you're dark-skinned, you need sunlight. That is what gets you to optimal health. You can't really do cold exposure and benefit from it like someone with uncoupled mitochondria. It's not really something you should be thinking about. While again, if you come from a higher latitude, if you have skin that sort of looks like this or is lighter, go ahead. You should be doing cold exposure. That is definitely something you should be trying out. As long as you don't have, again, I should have said this in the beginning, any pre-existing heart condition. Again, this is not medical advice. Nothing in this video is medical advice. But based on what we know, if you have a heart condition, it would not be recommended to do cold exposure. Credit to Dr. Doug Wallace for what I'm about to tell you. He is the one who found this out. But you inherit your mitochondrial DNA from your mother. This means that, for example, if your father is dark-skinned and your mother is fair-skinned, you actually got uncoupled mitochondria. Maybe you have dark skin, but you have uncoupled mitochondria. Your mitochondria are able to create heat, so you might consider doing cold exposure. Well, if you have the opposite scenario, if your mother is the one who is darker, and again, and you're mixed, and your father is the one who is fair-skinned, then actually you need more sun. You have coupled mitochondria. It's gonna be the case. Again, it depends on how dark your mother is. The darker, probably the more adapted she is, or her mitochondria are, to the equator. And so you would have more leeway, let's say. You'd be able to absorb more light at a little bit of a higher latitude, but your mitochondria wouldn't be as good at creating heat. So you have to look at your parents. If you have two parents that are adapted to different environments, okay, what environment is my mother adapted to? What kind of mitochondria do I have? And then you have to think about it. We get to a very important question. Is cold exposure stressful? And there's a very big lesson in this question, because it depends. You don't just have the health remedy. You don't just have the food or the practice or whatever it is. You also have the person, their history, their genes, what they're dealing with. You have the situation in the body, and you have what you're subjecting the body to. And it's not just the thing itself that will have some effect. It's also the condition of the body that changes what effect this thing has. So, me for example, I'm cold adapted. When I do cold water swimming, I feel quite fine. Yes, of course, there is the little teeny tiny adaptation period when you're getting into the water, but after that, I feel quite fine. And I'm not stressed in the water. I'm actually quite calm. It actually feels quite good in the water and afterward, after I've put my clothes on. Before putting the clothes on, if the wind is blowing, yeah, might not be the most comfortable experience. I will admit that. So, in general, I'm cold adapted. I can go out in minus 10 degrees Celsius, minus 11 degrees Celsius, shirtless, especially after a cold shower. That makes things very easy. And, I can take a walk. 20 minutes, 25 minutes, I've done that. This last winter, that's what I did in the morning. Now take a person who is very sensitive to the cold and compare them to a person who is very cold tolerant. View these people in your mind. Who looks the healthiest? Who do you associate with health? It's quite easy. The cold tolerant person. And the person who is very sensitive to the cold, usually a very unhealthy person. They bundle up a lot. They're pretty pale. Maybe their hormones aren't really there. If they're a man or if they're a woman, probably have fertility issues. Something like that. They're not a robust person. You look at Weston A. Price's description of the Swiss mountain people. The people in Vesperterminen or in the Lacental Valley. He said that the children would be playing in running water that was very cold. And this was maybe 5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, something like that. The children would run around in what we would consider in modern society summer clothing. That's what they would run around in. These are, again, isolated children from an isolated tribe. If you're a very sick person, you don't have any melanin inside, or very little at least, you're melanin deficient, your mitochondria aren't working, yeah, you need sunlight. If you try to do cold exposure and you try to benefit from cold exposure, again, the machinery needs to work for that to be the case. And so, you get in the cold, and if you don't feel any benefit afterward, you should probably not do cold exposure. It's not for you. It's actually stressful in that case. Also, let's say you're very, very thin, for example, or you have a mitochondrial haplotype that is very coupled, that can't uncouple and create heat. And you do cold exposure, and it doesn't work for you. You can't heat yourself up afterward, you just feel bad. Yeah, you probably shouldn't do it. It's gonna be stressful. As long as you're moderately healthy and you have the right genes, which is most people on the planet, if I'm not mistaken, you can do cold exposure. And see, you shouldn't debate this on the internet. If you want to find out if it's for you or not, what you do is this. I'm gonna outline a protocol later in the video. You can use that to become cold adapted should you wish to. It's the way I would do it if I had to start over. But you do that, and you see, okay, is my mind working faster? Is my digestive tract better? How are my blood markers, for example? If you regularly do blood tests, are my stress levels better? Am I calmer? Am I sleeping better? Look at all those things. Look at your cardiovascular efficiency. Are you breathing less? Are you breathing more? Did your heart rate go up or did it go down long term? Look at all these things. And if they improved, obviously what you've done has improved your health. In short, if you go out in -5 degrees Celsius and you feel like you're dying and you can't adapt, yeah, that's stressful. Maybe you should avoid that. Maybe that's too much at one point if you're not adapted yet. If you, like me, are able to go out in -5 degrees Celsius, like many other people, by the way, you're cold adapted and you're going out, you have no problems, you can, do ice baths in, let's say, 2 degrees Celsius, 1 degree Celsius, although you have to train to get there. You should probably start with 15 degrees Celsius, then down to 10 to 12, and then 7, etc. And then you go down there. And then it's pretty simple. It's not stressful. You adapt it to the environment. You're creating enough heat. You're getting all the benefits that we've spoken about already. Completely fine. That's something that's supposed to happen. Again, it's part of the circadian rhythm. It's part of your genome. Every mammal has this program. It's not a stress, it's something that is built into you. It's an ability that's built into you that you need to utilize at any latitude where it gets colder. Again, you don't just have the circadian rhythm, the 24-hour rhythm. You have a yearly rhythm and you have drastic biochemical changes happening from season to season. And during winter, this is supposed to happen to keep you as healthy as possible. I've tried it out. I know for a fact that when I do cold exposure and I expose myself to the temperature in the environment, when it is winter over here, I feel a lot better because there's no mismatch. This is built into me. And I'm just utilizing that program like every other animal does at this latitude. And as a human, as a mammal, I'm gonna do the same thing. Don't take my word for it. Don't believe anything I say. Try it out and see if it works. But naturally, that's not all I had to say about the stress. Let's play a short that I recorded a while ago, back in March. A researcher put his lab rats in cold water for 4 hours every day, and they lived 10% longer. The study found that flies live twice as long when you put them at 21 degrees Celsius as opposed to 27 degrees Celsius. That's a 100% increase in longevity. Another study found that a 5-degree drop in the environment of worms increased their longevity by 75%. The study showed that when you decrease the temperature of the water that fish swim in by 5 degrees Celsius, they live 75% longer. I believe the increased longevity may be due to the improved electrical flow inside the mitochondria, so your engines. And as you'll find written in this book, for each angstrom that the mitochondrial complexes get closer together, electron tunneling efficiency increases by tenfold. Okay, tenfold. And so if they get 1 angstrom apart, it decreases by tenfold. And at a certain distance, of course, they don't tunnel, and the mitochondria does not feel very well anymore. Actually, it will probably kill itself because of the mechanisms I highlighted earlier, that I learned, of course, from Nick Lane in the same book. If you look at this study, you'll see that when you do cold exposure, the complexes go closer together. This is an established biophysical mechanism in the scientific literature. And so, I want you to consider something. Yes, you might need to create more heat, sure, but if the complexes get together, there's an exponential increase in efficiency. I would argue that when someone is cold adapted and they're actually feeling well in the cold, their efficiency is higher than their need to create heat. So they're still creating more heat, of course, because they're in a colder environment, their body's going to create more heat. But their efficiency is so high that it makes up for it. While if your efficiency is very low, first of all, you won't be able to create heat. The complexes are probably already too far apart because of mitochondrial heteroplasmy, because you've damaged your mitochondria because of your environment. And so that's why you're cold sensitive. And that's why you're not necessarily increasing efficiency to a point where you can actually be in the cold without feeling cold, let's say. You're not actually creating enough heat. Basically, nature has figured this out, and it would be a shame to view cold as stressful, especially when we know that there are a bunch of people who can perfectly adapt to colder environments. So when it's winter, when it's autumn, when it's early spring and the temperatures are low at higher latitudes, these people can walk around without covering themselves and they're completely fine. And they're not stressed. The best example of these people are the people of... I'm deliberately telling this to the people who watched this deep into the video because you're actually going to benefit from the community. The people who only watch 2 minutes will not. I have a community on school called Excellent Health Academy, and I know how people progress in there. Their lives change a lot. They become more attractive. If they have acne, the acne disappears because that's really easy to get rid of. If you want support from me and you want a ton of resources, we have 60 hours plus of content, especially through recorded Q&A calls. It's only $19 per month and the value you get is absolutely humongous. Join if you want to. Regardless, I wish you the best of luck in your health journey. Let's continue. Tierra del Fuego, which is, if you view South America, the very end of the tail. That's where Tierra del Fuego is, in Argentina, the very bottom of Argentina. That's the 54th latitude, south. And over there, at least there was, a primitive group who we have pictures of. We have pictures of in the snow. They walk around completely naked the entire winter. When they're at camp, based on the pictures I've seen, they have these animal skins that they cover themselves with, and they do have fires. That's when they're still. When they're out and about, doing whatever they're doing during the winter, they are naked. This tribe is naked. They don't wear clothes from, all throughout the year. And if you look at the background, that's snow. That's snow over there. And as I've told you, I've done the same thing. I'm not as healthy as these people were. Of course not. I mean, I live in modern society. I didn't grow up in the pristine environment that these people grew up in. But as you can see, they're not stressed in the cold. Otherwise, they would put on clothes. And me, again, I've done this. Many other people in modern society have done this. For example, there's Wim Hof, who climbed up to Mount Everest's base camp, I believe, in just shorts. And if you read his descriptions, he was fine. He was feeling really well at high altitude and also in just shorts, climbing up through very rough terrain. Let's just say it that way. Then there's also a quote by a Roman, during the Roman Empire, of course, that was talking about a tribe, I believe, in Central Europe. I think it was a Germanic tribe, and he described their diet and their physical structure. These were very strong people. I believe he said that they were consuming raw meat and raw dairy, actually. I think so. And he was saying how they didn't wear too many clothes during the winter. Very little clothes, mostly bare-chested, mostly just a few rags. I can't seem to find the quote, unfortunately, but I know that I've read it several times. Someone can probably post it in the comments. Thank you for your service. You do create more free radicals in the cold. 100%. There's no doubt about it. And the reason is because the way we create UV light inside, for example, is through free radical recombination. And that is in this book right here. Actually, I have it right here. And I also have the quote right here. It's worthwhile to emphasize that recombination reactions of certain radicals release up to 480 kilojoules per mole energy. Such energy is sufficient to generate UV photons of about 230 nanometers. This may be relevant to the earlier spectral distribution of mitogenetic radiation, recording in the spectral range 190 to 350 nanometers. So again, now I'm speaking, that's UV. All that is UV. Cold exposure makes us create more UV, and that's fine and dandy. But to create UV, we need to recombine free radicals. Now, free radicals, they age you, don't they? They're very bad. No, they're not. You have to look at the context. They are absolutely needed for you to kill cells. You need that to recycle bad mitochondria, to kill them, to get rid of them. Why? Well, it's a complex process, but again, as we spoke about earlier, mitochondria kill the cell. They're the ones that control apoptosis. And when the mitochondria do this and kill the cell, they get rid of themselves. The bad mitochondria get rid of themselves by getting rid of the entire cell. And so the bad mitochondria kill themselves and you're left with the good mitochondria because They won't kill themselves because they don't accumulate free radicals. So you need to move, you need to be exposed to the cold, or you need mitochondrial support so that this process can happen. This is absolutely needed. And so free radicals are not bad. They're a signaling molecule. And again, you've got something called mitophagy. What I just described is mitophagy. Mitophagy is you getting rid of old mitochondria. If you do cold exposure, you'll be doing this by creating more free radicals. So not only are you creating more UV using them, you're also getting rid of your bad mitochondria, which keeps you healthy. You shouldn't have your bad mitochondria left inside you. They should be recycled. Just like if you have bad cells inside you, those should be recycled through autophagy. Aren't you putting a lot of strain on your cardiovascular system when you do cold exposure? Well, yes, that can be the case if you're someone who is untrained, and that's why, as I said earlier, if you have some kind of pre-existing heart condition, you should probably be a bit careful, because at least in the initial stages, your blood pressure will go up, your heart rate will go up. If you're untrained, you should be careful. Dr. Jack Kruse, I believe his recommendation is to only do cold exposure if your VO2 max is higher than 25. If you're able to adapt to the cold temperature, whether it's in water or in air, you'll notice that your breathing gets easier and that your cardiovascular system is more efficient. Your heart rate goes down, for example. For me, that's absolutely the case. Now, I want you to think about something. If you sprint really fast, you get exhausted, right? You have to breathe really heavily, etc. While in the cold, you're making your mitochondria work more, but you breathe more easily, and your heart rate gets slower. Now you have to try this out to see for yourself, but for me at least, this happens. And when I've read about why this happens, it all makes sense. It's because oxygen utilization becomes better and you're creating more infrared light. Infrared drives circulation. We've already talked about that in this video and also in other videos as well. So that's a no-brainer. You're creating more infrared, blood flow gets easier, sure. I believe you're also creating nitric oxide. That is actually what turns off NPY. eNOS turns off NPY. The article you need to read is Cold Thermogenesis 6. Kruse is who taught me this. I am not taking credit for this information. Now this is definitely something I learned from Kruse through him describing it. I'm going to describe it as well as I can. Oxygen is paramagnetic. Something that is paramagnetic is drawn to magnetic fields. Now, if you look at the mitochondria, I've talked about the ATP synthase, right? You're a spinning nanomotor. Now, when you have something powered by electricity that's spinning, such a thing creates a magnetic field. If you have an electrical appliance that's spinning, it creates a magnetic field. So your fan, be a little bit careful with your fan. What does that mean? That means that the ATP synthase is creating a magnetic field. And oxygen is supposed to go to the fourth complex, which is right next to ATP synthase, if I'm not mistaken. Oxygen is being drawn to the magnetic field created by the ATP synthase. So what does that mean? That means that when you do cold exposure, naturally you're going to increase the magnetic field of the ATP synthase because you're going to be creating more ATP, most likely. And so oxygen is going to be more easily drawn to the fourth complex. And this is why it becomes easier to breathe, because you're increasing the magnetism in your tissues. And if you want to learn more about this, read Cold Thermogenesis 5 by Dr. Jack Kruse. That article is also absolutely amazing. 5 and 6 will blow your mind, but they are technical. So make sure to, rub your head really well so that all the blood goes there. And all these reasons combined that we've been talking about in this video, that are quantum biological, biophysical, they're the reason why cold exposure and sprinting are so different. That's why when you do cold exposure, again, you get this efficiency effect, this positive effect, while when you do sprinting, you get exhausted and you need to breathe a bunch. In terms of cold and stress, we need to talk about the Arctic people, because there is this misconception that they're trying to stay warm, and the reason why they wear these big fat coats is because they hate the cold and they never do deliberate cold exposure. They do not expose themselves to the cold, and they're very good at shielding themselves from it. There's an argument, again, used to counter the people who promote cold exposure, saying that in very cold environments, the people aren't exposed to cold. This is false. First of all, the reason you need to wear something like that is because, although humans can adapt to very high latitudes, that doesn't mean that that's the healthiest place to live. Absolutely not. You're not supposed to be at that latitude. We definitely do better at lower latitudes. I'd say that if someone is dealing with something, I would put them in the tropics, as would Dr. Jack Cruz. I think he would agree with me on that. Usually he tells people to go to El Salvador, not Yakutia. There's a reason for that. You need to be healthier to be healthy in Yakutia. But if you're already dealing with something, you need the sun. You absolutely need the sun, and you need a stronger quantum yield. And the quantum yield in Yakutia is not that good, but in El Salvador it's way higher. And this is one of the keys to health. You could say the main key to health. And so when you live in an extreme environment, you have to wear those clothes, because again, we're not talking about -10. We're talking about -60. Again, I'm gonna repeat that. Not -10, -60. Even -40 is insane. Humans they can't walk around naked at -60. They need to wear clothes. So to adapt to that environment, you need those clothes. Further, if you put most modern people inside Inuit clothes, the Inuit, they do things, many cases, without gloves. If you make a standard Westerner do stuff without gloves, or expose their face to that extreme cold, those extreme winds, they will for sure get big skin problems on both their hands and their face. They might even get frostbite. Most likely, yeah, they're gonna get frostbite on their hands. They're not gonna be able to move their hands after a little while because it's so cold. They would need very big gloves. And the Inuit, they fish, so they have to do technical things with their hands. They're being exposed to the cold, okay? At least their face and hands, and that's giving them the cold signal. Further, you'd also feel very cold in those clothes, 100%. You put a standard Westerner inside their clothes, and they'd feel like it isn't enough. They'd feel cold all the time, living like they do. The Inuit are creating a bunch of heat, even inside of those clothes. That is something that people do not think about. When it's that cold in your environment, those clothes will not cut it. You'd need something super thick, but if it's very, very thick, you won't be able to move around. That's going to be the case. Those who are against cold exposure also say that the people beyond the Arctic Circle don't do deliberate cold exposure. Again, they're trying to stay warm, they're not doing what these crazy Westerners are doing. Well, this is false. They do cold exposure. Not for the same reasons as the Westerners, but they do view it in Inuit culture as healthy. They do it for health purposes and spiritual purposes, saying that it helps them reconnect to nature. It connects you to nature, may awaken, let's say, spiritual experiences, but also for health reasons. They recognize it in their culture, again, digging a hole in the ice and going in there and then out, as a health practice. Okay? Same thing with other Arctic people. One notable example is the Scandinavians. More specifically, if you go to Kiruna, which is the northernmost city in Sweden, it is very common to do ice baths there. They do that throughout the winter. Okay? And these are Arctic people. Now, the last thing would be, are these people being exposed to the cold, or are they avoiding it? Earlier I said that these people aren't warm all the time, that they're actually being exposed to the cold, and they're creating a lot of heat, and that's how they adapt to that environment. They're creating way more heat than a Westerner would in that environment because they're cold adapted. Now, how come they are not hot? How come their clothes are not making them warm? How do we know this? Is there a way to definitively prove this? Well, let me ask you a question. If you take a person in modern society who's supposed to have, let's say, darker skin, and you put them inside and you make them avoid the sun. I'm not talking very dark skinned. I'm talking sort of 30th latitude, something like that. Someone who can get very dark in the sun, but can turn pretty pale pasty with a dark tint during the winter, or if they really avoid the sun. If you go to, for example, El Salvador or Costa Rica, and you look at the people who deliberately avoid the sun, you will see that they can turn very white. These people are supposed to get very tan, but they can turn very white, and you can see that they're not pale, but there's a slight hint of melanin, but they look very pale, almost white, which is, I know, paradoxical, but you'll have to go to one of these countries where this is a phenomenon, and you'll have to, look at these people. My point is that without UV, you easily see people turn very pale in modern society. no matter what the genes are, as long as they're not super melanated. Despite this, despite the low UV environment beyond the Arctic Circle, again, there's no UV. And I know snow reflects UV, sure, it doubles it. However, the entire body of Arctic people is tan, and also if the UV is already low, if it's 0.5, the snow being there will only turn it up to a 1. So snow doesn't matter that much in a very low UV environment. And also the altitude isn't high because these people live at sea level usually, based on what I understand. Some people claim that these people, the Arctic people, are dark because of migration, because people who are darker migrated to these regions and the genetic adaptations haven't occurred. If you put someone in a very low UV environment, they're gonna get very pale. That always happens. You have very quick melanin loss if you're not in the sun. You look at anyone, this happens. Now, they continue to be dark in the Arctic regions. Even if you look at the Sami people, I believe they're also a bit darker. They have melanin. You look at the Nenets people, I believe they're also darker. They're darker than people in Scandinavia. Why is that? I believe they're creating a bunch of alpha MSH, and this is where the melanin is coming from. Can I absolutely confirm that this is the case? No, not necessarily, but it's very plausible. I believe that what's happening is that they're creating a lot of melanin inside, and they're creating so much, and they're breaking down so little because they live in a still low EMF, pristine, isolated and primitive environment, at least 100 years ago, not anymore of course, that it actually shows up on their surfaces because they have an excess. Also, from what I understand, melanin on the surface helps you tolerate cold better. So them having melanin on the outside, them creating it through alpha MSH in the cold, makes a lot of sense. So in a very cold environment, it would make sense that people have darker skin. Again, in terms of the stress thing, if you look at my full day of living video, you see me in the water, I felt completely fine, I felt happy. If that's the case for you, you're not stressed. It's fine for you to do, okay? As long as you don't have a pre-existing heart condition. Again, not medical advice. However, if your sleep gets worse, if your energy levels are really low afterward, consistently, like the day after, your sleep is bad, whatever it might be, if you're experiencing negative things, don't do it. Because maybe you don't have the appropriate infrastructure to do it. Does eating fish make you smarter? Now, this is very related to cold, but you'll have to bear with me. So you may have heard of DHA, it's a form of omega-3. You may also have heard that there's a bunch of omega-3 in fish, right? So DHA is a form of omega-3, and this is the form that's in your brain. It's very abundant in your brain. And in fact, if you don't get this guy, your brain doesn't work. You become stupid, you get brain fog, learning becomes harder, cognition becomes harder in general, and my guess is that if you look at the literature, the risk of neurodegenerative diseases increases drastically in DHA deficient people. I believe this is what we see. I also believe, according to Andy Galpin, I watched an episode where he was talking about brain injuries and how to recover from them, that DHA is protective against brain injuries, and that tells you how important it is for the brain. Now, where do we get DHA? We get it from marine life. Now I want to ask you a question. You've obviously got mackerel off of the Norwegian coast, Northeast Atlantic. You've got mackerel in the Mediterranean. If you go to Spain, Portugal, you've got a bunch of mackerel being fished off of the coast over there. So obviously there's mackerel over there, although it's a bit different. But then if you go to El Salvador or Costa Rica, for example, you also find mackerel there, although it's Pacific mackerel. It's a different species, of course, but it's still mackerel. Now my question is, this is the same fish, it's fish in general. Which of these three types of mackerel will have the most DHA? What do you think? The one at the Norwegian coast is the correct answer. And then, second highest, Mediterranean. Now at the equator, Costa Rica, El Salvador, least DHA. Why is that? Well, here's the deal. We view food as, this is liver, this is brain, I'm gonna eat this, I'm gonna eat that. If you actually think about it, the muscle meat that you're eating, or the fat tissue, or the liver, it's technically not meant for consumption. The liver of that animal is supposed to keep that animal alive, doing what the liver is doing inside of that animal, right? So when we think of food, you can't just think of nutrients as oh, this guy is high in this nutrient or that nutrient. You have to think, why does this organism have this nutrient in the first place? You may think, well, this just comes down to the species, the genes of each animal and them creating a bunch of DHA, or it comes down to the diet of the fish in each of these regions. Nope, not necessarily related. The environment is what shapes the organism. It also determines its health, but the environment, as admitted by Darwin as well, is what shapes the organism. So wherever you put an organism, it will be shaped by the factors in the environment that it finds itself in. And you see a very interesting relationship here. What's the difference between all these three places? The equator, the Mediterranean, and then the Norwegian coast? The latitude, isn't it? It's far colder in the water at the Norwegian coast as opposed to at the equator. And what you need to know about DHA, again, I'll have to tell you this because it's specific knowledge, is that cell membrane signaling gets worse in the cold. And so the fatty acid ratio in the cell membrane has to change. This applies to humans and it also applies to fish. So the fish off of the Norwegian coast or in colder waters need more DHA in them to function. But now let's think about this for a moment. The people in Norway, is it colder in Norway or in Costa Rica? Well, it's colder in Norway, right? I just told you that it doesn't matter if it's a fish or a human. The fatty acid composition in the cell membrane will need to change to accommodate the temperature in the environment. So also the temperature changes in the environment at higher latitudes. And so this means that the Norwegian people who are in a place where it gets colder will need more DHA than the people at the equator. And this is why I say that when you follow nature's laws and you eat locally and you abide by the seasons, the temperature changes in the environment and the food availability in your region, you will not be breaking any of nature's laws, and so you'll be healthy. If the Norwegian people, let's say during the winter or throughout the year, eat mackerel from the coast of El Salvador, for some reason they get access to that, that will be a problem because they're not getting enough DHA. They need their own mackerel off of their coast because that fish contains enough DHA for their latitude. Again, look at the latitude. Norwegian latitude, they need Norwegian latitude fish. So am I saying that if you're gonna do more cold exposure, you should be consuming more DHA? Yes, but in relation to your latitude. Or let's say you're very DHA deficient for some reason, or you're dealing with some problem, or you've been in an environment before where you're destroying DHA. Again, just a little secret, artificial blue light destroys DHA, okay? So be careful with artificial light, because if you buy high quality fish with lots of DHA, that let's say costs a little bit extra, and you're in artificial blue light, you're losing money by the second. Just thought I'd tell you that. So yes, if you eat DHA, cold exposure will become easier and you'll get through the winter more easily. And what I'm also saying is that if you're at a higher latitude and you're not eating DHA, may God have mercy on your soul. That is all I'm saying. May God have mercy on your soul. Now, what does DHA actually do? Why does it help in the cold? And why would it actually make cold exposure more beneficial? Well, hear me out, because this molecule, this fatty acid, is a quantum machine. It turns light into electric signals in the body. And that's why you have a lot of DHA in the retina. I believe Dr. Jack Kruse says that it's the place where we have the most DHA in the entire body, or at least the highest density, you could say. And the reason is simple. Light has to turn into an electric signal very accurately and very, very quickly to give the correct signal to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the master circadian clock in your brain. And so you need lots of DHA through this entire pathway, from the eye to the brain, so that this signal can work really, really well, so that it's really fast and smooth, right? If you don't have DHA there, then it will be very hard to turn the light into an electric signal that then tells your circadian clock what's happening, And so that can tell, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, so that it can tell the other cells what's happening, what they should be doing, what hormones to produce, how much energy to create, etc. Alright, it makes sense that light from the outside hits us, hits the DHA, and then turns into an electric signal that tells the brain something or the body something. And then that's how the cells do different things. That's how they get the signals from the outside, so that the body knows what to do. Again, that's what the entire circadian rhythm is about. It's about, okay, what's happening in the environment and what are we supposed to do? Oh, it got dark, we should probably sleep. Oh, now it's daytime, we should probably hunt, we should probably move around, shouldn't we? That's what the circadian rhythm is about. Connecting you and your biochemical processes to the environment for survival. That's what that is. We have DHA on the inside as well. Why would we have that? Do you recall that we emit light on the inside? Do you recall that DHA is in the cell membrane? Where is this light being emitted? Well, probably into the cell membrane and the cell membranes of other cells as well. So if you had DHA in the cell membranes, wouldn't that be transforming the light into electric signals? It would, wouldn't it? Do cells need to communicate with each other? Absolutely. You can carry a lot of information very quickly and without using much energy utilizing light. And now you might realize why a human can live 100 years plus, because nature is incredibly smart and has set up amazing systems for you that you can't even fathom. And one of the things it requires in all mammals is DHA. You need DHA to be able to do this with light. Am I also saying that DHA would then help you gain more out of sunlight? Yes. Am I saying that DHA would make you gain more out of cold exposure? Yes, we've already established that. Why would it then make you smarter? Well, isn't DHA absolutely needed for cells to communicate with each other? Cells being efficient in general, being able to turn electrical signals into light and light into electrical signals? Well, where would this be incredibly important? In the brain, wouldn't it? It's the thing that has cells communicating with each other the most. And it requires a lot of energy, so you have a lot of mitochondria emitting a lot of light. And so you constantly need to recycle this energy. And DHA helps with that. And so that's why you have so much DHA in the brain. The brain requires DHA to function because of DHA's role that we've just described here. Being a quantum machine, you could say. A quantum converter, you could call it. So now you understand why I would recommend that you eat your mackerels and your sardines and your oysters. But of course, it's your choice. I understand that you may be concerned about heavy metals. You may be already writing your comment or thinking about writing your comment. Please wait a moment and hear me out. The only thing I need to say about heavy metals is this. Are the Japanese really smart and very good at most fields that you can imagine? Music, literature, engineering, medicine, whatever it might be. They are. They're amazing. They excel at everything. Are we shaped by our environment, or are we shaped by genes just being completely random? Darwin even admitted that we are shaped by our environment. That is the absolute biggest factor when it comes to how an organism will turn out. The environment that it finds itself in, right? And so, the Japanese are really smart. What do we know about heavy metals? They mess up the brain, don't they? Mercury makes you stupid. Heavy metals will of course mess up the brain. They disturb the biochemical and quantum processes in the brain as well. And so, your brain doesn't work anymore. Now, do the Japanese eat a lot of seafood rich in DHA? Yes. Do they eat raw seafood, which preserves even more DHA? Yes. Are they then perhaps consuming more heavy metals? I'm not sure. How has this turned out for them? If you ask me, overwhelmingly positive. And so, I will eat my seafood, thank you, and I will not listen to the modern establishment. It's an interesting correlation, isn't it? Think about it, and you may choose to do what you want with it. There's a question we haven't answered yet. How do you actually become cold adapted? Are cold showers enough? Do you just go outside with a t-shirt when it's cold outside? Do you do ice baths? Do you do ice swimming? Do you Just do leg plunges. There are many ways of doing it. How should you structure it? What's the most effective way? That's also fairly painless. Well, I think the best method is in this book, EpiPaleoRx by Dr. Jack Kruse. The entire book is great, so I think you should read all of it. But if you specifically want the cold stuff, you go to the end of the book, under Appendix B. Or not the cold stuff, there's a lot of cold stuff in here, but the cold protocol, the cold adaptation protocol, more specifically. The best I've ever found is, of course, in this book. Now, if you don't want to do that, you can just listen to me. Kruse's version is the 300 IQ version of what I'm about to tell you. Mine is a little bit more basic. I think mine is faster as well. And the reason I'm going to talk about the way I did it is because I haven't actually done Kruse's protocol. I think it's the best. It's definitely the best. It's the most detailed. It's the most scientific as well. But it's lengthy, in my opinion, and it requires you to buy certain things as well. The way I do it is just through water and air. That's all. And if you live in a cold environment, you'll have access to cold air and cold water. Here's the deal. Are cold showers enough? That's the first thing to address. No. In my method, you have measuring sticks. You have cold showers and you have air immersion. So what I'd do is I'd take cold showers every day, sometimes up to 4 cold showers in one day. I'd have many instances of cold exposure, and this could come from just a pure cold shower or a contrast shower where you use hot water first and then cold water afterward. You're still getting cold exposure. It's just that you loaded yourself with infrared before. The other measuring stick is air. You go outside with minimal clothing, either a t-shirt or you just go shirtless. Now, if you're a woman, this is a little bit more difficult, I understand. Just think, what would I wear if it's a hot summer day and I'm gonna go work out, so I'm gonna be even hotter? That's what you wear. That's what you choose. Ideally, shorts, a t-shirt, something like that. And if you're a man who is very self-conscious, which I don't think you should be, there's no reason to be self-conscious, especially if it's snowy. People understand that what you're doing is sort of cold training. You can do t-shirt and shorts as well. The easier these two become, the more cold adapted you are. We're using them as measuring sticks, but you have to remember that they're both very healthy regardless. It's just that they won't push you into very cold adapted territory quickly. What I want for you is you, again, go outside with summer clothing at minus 10 degrees Celsius, if that's a temperature that your environment reaches, and you're fine. Like, seriously, you're fine. If I were to wear a thin cotton sweater when I was, at my peak cold adaptation, I would feel nothing. I'd just feel completely fine. What's really important is that you understand what temperature you're dealing with. So what you're gonna buy is this: a cheap steak thermometer from Amazon. Because you don't want to sit there and measure it very slowly. No, you want something that's really fast. And these steak thermometers, they're accurate and they're really fast, because when you're cooking, you might not have a lot of time. So they need to be fast. They're also cheap. They might cost something like $10 approximately on Amazon. And so you buy one of these, and then if you're dealing with water, you check the coldest water that you have available. You can check the air temperature as well. If you're gonna do cold water immersion, of course, if you have a bathtub, you can open up the cold water and then a little bit of the hot water, and then you can see what temperature is this water. Let's say the coldest is 5 degrees Celsius, but let's say you're a beginner and you're gonna do 12 degrees Celsius. Well, then you can slowly monitor the warm water together with the cold water to see, okay, now it's 12 degrees Celsius, and then you fill it up with that water, and then now you have 12 degrees Celsius. And if you can't measure the temperature, it becomes hard to track your progress. That's my point. So get a steak thermometer. It's also just very useful in general, because measuring temperature is a pretty convenient thing. Before you move on to the actual steps, you need to realize something. Anything that makes your mitochondria healthier or unhealthier will affect this process. When you want to cold adapt, you have to be very disciplined. You can't go out and party. You can't have a bad circadian rhythm or expose yourself to artificial light. Again, partying. can't drink alcohol, no smoking. Make sure you do everything correctly. All health pillars. No dehydration, no EMF. Just take care of all health pillars. They need to be taken care of because they all affect your mitochondria. And you want your mitochondria to be working as well as they possibly can. The good news is that cold exposure itself will make them absolutely amazing, because even if they're bad, if you go from not being cold adapted to very cold adapted, you had to have created very efficient and strong mitochondria. That has to be the case. Otherwise, you can't be cold adapted. And that might be why you get so many benefits. That's just one reason why, at least. For nutrition, remember, you want to eat a lot of fat. We use fat to create heat, so eat fat. High quality animal fat, more specifically, that's local to your environment. That's very important. There are details that I went into in the skin video about this. If you want to know about locality and seasonality, you go to that video. If you get cold urticaria, you get hives when you do cold exposure, that means that you haven't been eating fish and you've been eating garbage for a very long time. That means that your omega-6 to 3 ratio is really bad. The better your omega-6 to 3 ratio is, the better. The better you'll be able to cold adapt. The faster that process will be, the easier you'll be able to handle the cold. DHA and fat. No carbohydrates, because they're not growing in your environment. And if for some reason they are growing, sure, go ahead and eat them. I have no problems with that. Now that we've got the basics covered, this is what you do. First, whenever you're gonna do a cold shower, whenever you're gonna go outside in cold air, whenever you're gonna do any cold exposure, I want you to splash your face with cold water. And if you don't want to do that, again, that's the lazy way. Cruz actually says that for 2 weeks you should only be dunking your face. That's why I said that it's a slower approach, although it's far superior because it actually cold adapts you in the easiest manner possible. However, I think that's too boring. And maybe you do as well. So you can get a big bowl of water. Again, you can fill it with ice. You can put your face in and you can do cold water dunks. And this will cold adapt you by activating the mammalian dive reflex. It's all, one system. The things that happen usually when you do a cold shower or an ice bath, they will happen when you just dunk your face, when you activate the mammalian dive reflex. Your heart rate will go down and you're gonna vasoconstrict, which means that, again, you're gonna close off the surface capillaries to shunt blood into the core. This means that before the cold plunge or the cold shower, you're doing something that's painless. In my opinion, it's painless. Again, you activate the dive reflex and you start creating more heat. Your body's prepared, now you get into the cold shower. Okay? Done with that, what do you do now? Now that you've done the cold shower, you're already creating heat, right? And you feel really good, and you feel like you can handle cold better. So what you do is this, and this is what I did. And you may modify this based on, again, your environment, the temperature outside, etc. I'd do this before sunrise, a little bit before sunrise. So when sunrise was occurring, that is when I would go outside. So again, splash the face, cold shower, and then I'd go out shirtless with a cap on, just so that my hair wouldn't fly everywhere because it's very windy where I am. And I wouldn't wear anything on my hands. I would just put my hands in my pockets, and I'd wear long pants. I didn't have shorts at the time, but I would do shorts instead, and then boots. Because again, the hands and the feet are more sensitive, so you may do them separately or you may do them during your sessions. It really depends on your starting point. They've always been my weaknesses, so for me, I've needed to train them separately. Then I'd go outside again in this manner. Didn't matter what the temperature was. It might have been 5 degrees Celsius or minus 11 degrees Celsius. To me, honestly, when it was minus 11, the stimulus happened faster. My body triggered the heat production faster, and so I actually felt more comfortable. The only thing that would hurt eventually as I was approaching the house is my wrists. That's all. And that's because when I'd do the cold plunges, this area right here, my wrist, wouldn't get into the water. I wouldn't put my hands in because, again, the water was 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. And again, this will depend on your environment, what you have access to. But Continuing on, I do this walk and I'd do it for 20 to 30 minutes. The shortest would be 15 minutes, something like that. So 15 to 30 minutes, something like that. I'd go to a nearby forest, and sometimes when the sky would be clear, I would see the sun crossing the horizon, and it was absolutely glorious. If you have the opportunity to do that, it feels amazing, especially if you're shirtless and minus 11 degrees Celsius. And I promise you, I did not feel stressed or bad or in pain. I felt amazing, shirtless and minus 11 degrees Celsius, even before the sun was shining on me. Now, when it was cloudy, I'd just take a normal walk, usually. I wouldn't go to the forest and see the sun crossing the horizon. Again, this will depend on where you are and what's available to you. You'll have to be creative. Now, that would be the morning. Then, let's say I'd have a cognitively demanding task in front of me. Of course, cold exposure makes me feel amazing. It resets everything. Like if something in my life, for example, bothers me, if my family are not being very conscious people, if I just do a contrast shower, and I exaggerate the cold a little bit, I feel amazing. It's like nothing ever happened. It's really amazing, isn't it? So if I have a cognitively demanding task, I do cold exposure because I feel like my brain works a lot better after doing that. And no, it's not like caffeine, because it would hurt your brain over time, and all I've noticed is that my mental acuity has increased as I've been doing cold exposure. But so that's that. That would be 2 cold showers in total up until this point. Then, sort of at noon, I'd feel very strong. I'd feel the strongest at noon, and I'd go to my lake that's frozen over. It's 1.7 kilometers away. I'd go there, and there would be a place where I could remove, I can't really explain what it is, but they've put a frame inside of the ice with these 3 wooden blocks, and you take them out, and these blocks prevent the ice from freezing. So it's a sort of cold plunge setup they've made there. So I go there, and I'd measure the water every day, and at its coldest it was 0.8 degrees Celsius. In the beginning I could only do 30 seconds, something like that. First 3 days I could only do 1 minute, something like that. Eventually it became 7 minutes. I did 7 minutes and 0.8 degrees Celsius. And you might imagine what happens to you when you do cold exposure, cold plunges at such low temperatures. You suddenly go from feeling like the cold shower is cold to not feeling it at all. You suddenly go from you walking outside with a t-shirt being cold to it not being cold at all. You really become cold adapted quickly if you do cold water immersion in really cold water. In my opinion, this is the absolute fastest way to do it. And this is, again, my secret. Why do it outside? Well, you got near infrared light outside. You don't have that inside. The water in the lake is grounded, okay? And things, according to Dr. Jack Cruz, I learned this from him, are more thermally efficient when they're grounded. And so, again, if you're in your bathtub that isn't grounded, that's gonna be worse because you're not getting any electrons. Usually you can't walk barefoot on grass and get a bunch of electrons during the winter, but I could get a bunch of electrons. I got a huge amount of electrons whenever I would do the cold plunge. Why? The water is really close to 4 degrees Celsius. It's really dense, it's very cold, and so the electron flow will be even better. So it's a fantastic way to do earthing, to get a lot of electrons during the winter. Because again, you can't walk barefoot outside unless you're Wim Hof and you've really trained your feet. So this is a good way of doing it. And that means that it was easier to do cold exposure in the lake as opposed to the bathtub. Originally, I began with the bathtub. I'd do 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, and I'd do that beginning from 5 minutes at sort of 12 degrees Celsius to 20 minutes at 12 degrees Celsius, and then I eventually moved down to the coldest water, which was again 6.7 degrees Celsius, something like that. I think I worked up to 15 minutes in that. And then I completely went over to the lake water. Why? Because I was outside. And being outside is way more important than even cold exposure. It was also less painful, even though it was much colder. And also the walk. After becoming really cold adapted, Even when it was, let's say, 0 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, I wouldn't put a shirt on. I would go to the lake, 1.7 kilometers, shirtless, and 2 degrees Celsius. I'd go in the water. Again, very cold water. We're talking, well, 3 weeks after it was 0.8 degrees Celsius, it became, this was in March, around 4 degrees Celsius, something like that. So we're talking 2 degrees to 4 degrees Celsius, sort of during this period. I'd get out of the water, I'd dry myself, I'd put on my clothes, but not a shirt, only pants and boots. And then I'd put everything in my backpack, my towel, etc. And I'd walk back home, 1.7 kilometers, shirtless, 2 degrees Celsius, after having been in really cold water. Some people claim that if you were to go into that kind of water in nature, you would die. Well, let me ask you a question. Did I die? And if you're asking, yes, I could reheat shirtless. Sometimes I'd meet someone on the way and then I'd stand there and speak to them shirtless, and suddenly, I'd feel like I don't even need to return home. In general, outside, do 10 to 20 minutes, something like that. That's what I would work up to. If it's really, really cold, 5 minutes is probably enough. Just try to work up to that slowly. Again, you don't need to push yourself. Whenever you feel like something is going wrong, something is too cold. For me, it was my feet. My feet would be the warning sign in the really cold water, the lake water. Again, relatively, not necessarily to me when I was cold adapted, but in relation to the general population, my feet would be the thing that forced me up, my toes more specifically. So I would listen to my toes, and when my toes couldn't take it, I would get up. I never risked it. In general, if you just have access to a bathtub, as long as there's no excessive electrical wiring outside and it's at the ground level and you have a window, try to ground it using a copper wire. That is far better than just doing it ungrounded. You'll have to try both to see if this is the case or not, but I can tell you that when I do it in the lake, it feels way better. Way, way better. And it's obvious why that is. You're in nature as opposed to in an artificial bathtub inside. Again, that's not our natural environment. The lake, way more natural. Your earth, correct light environment. Aim for 10 to 12 degrees Celsius. That's 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, I believe. And you work up to 45 minutes. If your hands or feet are killing you, at 5 minutes, get out. At 2 minutes, get out. You don't need to do 45 minutes. I never did 45 minutes. I did that in El Salvador, by the way, but not at home. I didn't do it, and that was a grounded bathtub that was, again, outside, so it's a different story. But in my home, I never did it that way. I worked up to 20 minutes and then I went over to the lake permanently. Never went back to the bathtub because, again, my bathtub can't really ground it. And then you do that every day, and once you feel like it's easy, once you feel like you're just losing time, like you don't want to do 45 minutes in 12 degrees Celsius because it's just so easy, you move down to 8, and then just the coldest. And if the coldest isn't enough, you add in ice. That's the way to do it. And so that's sort of it. You just find what you have access to. Okay, a bathtub, or maybe ice is really cheap. You get that, and you do it in your bathtub at home. Sure, that's completely fine. Or you have a lake nearby, and you do the lake. You time yourself, you check the temperature of the lake, you continue that way. The last thing I want to mention is that in nature, the real way we would cold adapt is the seasonal changes would take care of it. Air temperature slowly, very slowly gets colder. We adapt, we slowly create more heat. Our fatty acid composition slowly changes. If, for example, you have a lake nearby, in the summer, it's fine to swim and everything, but let's say you do a swim or a plunge every single day from summer until, let's say, October, November. And as the lake gets colder, as the landscape turns white, may you create heat ever so efficiently. Go and achieve excellent health. I know you can do it. God bless you.